They laughed like it was the punchline of a joke I hadn't been invited to. Glasses clinked, a chandelier scattered light across the table, and my red wine caught the glitter and threw it back at me. I sat at the edge of the group, a quiet shape in a room full of loud men, as Daniel Pierce and his friends toyed with my life like a pastime. Another month unemployed, huh? One of them jeered. You should apply at a cafe. Maybe you'll get lucky. Daniel Pierce laughed, the sound bright and cruel. Yeah, who knows? Coffee shop assistant. That'd be something. I lowered my head, smiling as if their barbs landed as nothing more than small stones. They didn't see the way my hand tightened around the stem of my glass, the tiny storm building behind my ribs. They couldn't know that in less than 24 hours their world would be dismantled by the very woman they were mocking. For 7 years I'd worn a careful lie. To them I was the meek, struggling wife, soft-spoken, unambitious, the wife Daniel Pierce could parade and then quietly dismiss. But the truth was the opposite. My name is Amelia Grant. I am the founder and CEO of Sterling Corporation. I built the company. I built the system they thrived in. And tonight, I let them think they were joking. When I first met Daniel Pierce, I decided to see what would happen if I let him believe one version of me. I presented myself as Emily Brooks, a freelance financial consultant scraping by. I rented a modest apartment, drove an ordinary car, and practiced humility until it felt natural. Daniel Pierce loved the role of provider. He leaned into it, basked in the power it gave him. Slowly, contempt crept from behind his smile. Praise turned to patronizing remarks. My success, real, steady, and hidden, wasn't something he could boast about, so he erased it instead. They talked as if money and titles meant character. They bragged about contracts and promotions, unaware that each signature they celebrated had come from my desk. They didn't understand that the promotions I approved, the budgets I signed, the headhunters I paid, those were the strings I pulled. They never suspected the puppeteer was at the center of the stage. 2 years ago, I began to collect proof. Suspicion alone wouldn't be enough. I needed record and witness and an undeniable trail. I hired private investigators to follow late-night meetings, to log dinners paid for with company funds, to copy emails and transactions. I built an invisible data collection network inside our infrastructure, secure, discreet, and utterly revealing. What emerged was worse than petty corruption. Daniel Pierce and his circle had been colluding with rivals, trading confidential bids, diverting funds into personal accounts, and cultivating a culture of humiliation and exploitation beneath the polished surface. I didn't stop at documents. I knew that public reckoning would need to be a spectacle they couldn't spin away. So I became Emily Brooks, a timid applicant with worn shoes, and I walked into my own company to see them behave as they always did when they thought no one with power was watching. The interview room on the 7th floor smelled faintly of stale coffee and ambition. 3 men sat opposite me, faces I knew from gatherings where they'd elbowed me aside and traded jokes at my expense. You've been out of work a while, haven't you? One of them said, flicking through my resume like it was a curiosity exhibit. He smirked as if my desperation was entertaining. They barely listened. More than half the interview was spent making me the butt of their jokes. One man took out his phone and started texting while I answered. When their screens buzzed, they all looked down and laughed. Daniel Pierce had sent word he was in on the performance. I left with my head bowed, pretending embarrassment, while inside I cataloged every look, every dismissive gesture. The humiliation fed the plan. That night I slept not in fear, but in quiet calculation. The next morning I walked through Sterling's main lobby the way any CEO would calm, composed, unafraid. The boardroom was primed, shareholders summoned, executives present, and on the massive screen behind me, the evidence weighted like a guillotine. When Daniel Pierce and his four closest allies strode in with that same smug confidence, I watched their faces change as the floor shifted beneath them. "Sit down, Daniel Pierce," I said, my voice steady. Their bravado fluttered. For the first time in years, the man who had mocked me in public was unmoored. He scanned the room, confusion overtaking anger as his eyes found me not as Emily, but as Amelia Grant, founder, CEO, the woman who had created the very empire he'd been leeching from. "I'd like to formally reintroduce myself," I told them. "I am Amelia Grant, founder and CEO of Sterling Corporation." Silence slammed the room in two. Their smiles froze, then fell away into pale, panicked expressions. I clicked a button and the screen burst to life. Documents, emails, intercepted messages, bank transfers, every shred of their misconduct illuminated and crisp. Incontrovertible detail. "For the past 2 years," I continued, "I have collected records of illegal transactions, of company funds diverted to personal luxuries, of emails traded with competitors, and of conversations meant to be private." I met Daniel Pierce's eyes. "And yes, of the countless times you humiliated and exploited those beneath you." He opened his mouth, then closed it. Sweat beaded on foreheads that had never known a real consequence. I slid a stack of termination letters across the table, signed, dated, and final. "Effective immediately," I said. "You are all terminated." Daniel Pierce lurched to his feet, fury and disbelief contorting his face. "You can't do this." "I'm the vice president. I built this company." He barked. "You built nothing without me," I cut in. "I hired you. I let you into this company. You were guests at my table, and tonight you are leaving it." Security arrived as the boardroom doors swung open. The men who had wielded power like a shield found themselves escorted out under the same fluorescent lights. Where they had once preened, the shareholders watched as their heroes unraveled. Some whispered, some hung their heads, and some nodded slowly, relief and vindication mixing on their faces. I felt no gloat in that moment, only a fierce, clean clarity. This was accountability. This was righting a wrong no public apology could have fixed. I had wanted the truth to be seen and to stick. I wanted those who had been crushed beneath their arrogance to be able to breathe again. In the days that followed, Sterling Corporation trembled but did not fall. We worked to repair the contracts and deep clean the systems that had been poisoned by greed. Some executives tried to spin excuses. Most slipped quietly away. Former targets of abuse came forward with their own stories, and a new leadership structure began to take shape, one built on transparency and professional respect rather than entitlement. Daniel Pierce tried to fight back at first threats. Frantic calls, attempts to leverage old alliances, but every move he made only tightened the noose. He had spent years assuming others would carry the cost of his choices. For the first time, he discovered what it felt like to be the one carrying consequence. As for me, I reclaimed what was mine in more ways than one. I stepped fully into the public role I had long concealed, not for vanity, but to shepherd Sterling toward a healthier future. I rebalanced priorities, appointed leaders who value people over profits, and created channels for complaints that couldn't be crushed by a smirk and a power lunch. The company became a place where work was respected and dignity protected. That evening, long after the press conferences and the briefings, I sat alone in my office and allowed myself something almost foreign: quiet. The echo of the boardroom had been replaced by the soft hum of the city. No one laughed at me there. No one assumed my success was borrowed. I let the relief wash through me, gratitude for the team that stood by me, and a steady, simmering sorrow for the way power had been abused. I had engineered a reckoning. Yes, but the cost had been private nights of vigilance and planning. I had hidden my strength to survive a system that rewards noise and showmanship. Now, with the air cleared, I could lead as myself openly, forcefully, unhumanly. When Daniel Pierce's name came up in board conversations, it was a cautionary tale rather than a scandal to be gossiped about. People who had once joked at my expense began to meet me with the respect talent and integrity earn, not with the condescension of old. And while some wounds lingered, they became reminders of why I had built walls of accountability in the first place. I never wanted to humiliate for sport. I wanted justice. I wanted a workplace where the quiet could rise without being crushed, where competence was not mistaken for weakness. Standing at the head of Sterling's table, I learned that power given without responsibility is a poison, one that must be excised for any organization to survive. Outside the window, the city carried on traffic, lights, life. Inside, the company breathed again. I closed my laptop and looked at the empty chair where Daniel Pierce had once sat. I felt a small, steady satisfaction, not the thrill of victory, but the relief of having reclaimed integrity for a place that mattered to hundreds of people. Tomorrow, the board would meet to finalize the new leadership plan. Tonight, I allowed myself a quiet glass of wine, not to stave off fear, but to honor a hard, deliberate victory. The men who laughed at me had helped build the case against themselves. Their arrogance had been the last thing to fall. And in the soft dark that followed, I thought of the many quiet people who would no longer be afraid to speak up. That was the real triumph. That was the reason I had never stopped watching, documenting, and waiting for the right moment to pull the curtain back. Security stepped inside, ready to escort the newly terminated executives out of the building. Daniel Pierce staggered back, his eyes wide with disbelief. He turned to his colleagues, silently begging for support, but none met his gaze. Every single one of them looked down, their loyalty dissolving in an instant. He was utterly alone. I calmly gathered the remaining documents on the table and said, "Your belongings have been packed. Your access to the company systems has been revoked. Leave quietly before I make this worse for you." Daniel Pierce trembled, but said nothing. One by one, they were led out of the boardroom. Men who had once strutted through these halls like kings, now stripped of their thrones. I didn't bother to watch them go. From the upper floors, I could already see a crowd forming in the lobby, employees peering through the glass walls as news spread through the building like wildfire. Sterling Corporation had finally cut out the rot that had been poisoning it for years. It didn't take long for the story to break. By evening, every financial news outlet was ablaze with headlines about the massive purge at Sterling Corporation. Social media exploded with old employees and industry insiders, revealing stories of how Daniel Pierce and his clique had abused their power. Calls from rival firms began flooding in, not to hire Daniel Pierce, but to praise me. No one wanted to touch the disgraced men who had been publicly exposed. Within days, their empire of arrogance collapsed. 3 of their wives filed for divorce within a week, unwilling to trade luxury for shame. Daniel Pierce, once the vice president with a panoramic office and a taste for Rolexes, now worked behind a counter at a small electronics store on the outskirts of the city. The man who had mocked me for being unemployed was now selling cell phones to pay rent. I didn't need to see him to know that I had won. I didn't need revenge laced with cruelty. I had simply reclaimed what was mine. 3 months after their removal, Sterling Corporation no longer resembled the toxic place they once ruled. I sat in my office, sunlight spilling across the skyline of New York, and allowed myself to breathe. The company I built was alive again, creative, innovative, and finally free. On the very first day after the purge, I called for an all-company meeting. As I stood before thousands of employees, I was no longer Daniel Pierce's quiet wife. I was Amelia Grant, founder and CEO of Sterling Corporation. We're starting over, I told them. And this time, no one will be left behind. Change began immediately. I dismissed every enabler who had turned a blind eye to years of harassment and discrimination, especially those in HR who had protected powerful. In their place, I brought back talented professionals who had been pushed out for refusing to submit to corruption. Within weeks, more than 20 former employees returned, including Natalie Brooks, a brilliant software engineer Daniel Pierce had once humiliated and fired simply for rejecting his advances. When I called Lisa to offer her a position, she hesitated. "Do you really want me back?" she asked softly. "I don't just want you back," I told her. "I want you to lead our new AI research division." A week later, Lisa walked through Sterling's front doors with confidence, not fear. And she wasn't the only one. The company culture had transformed. We implemented transparency policies, anonymous reporting systems, and mandatory ethics training for all senior leaders. For the first time, employees no longer worked under threat or manipulation. Instead, they worked with pride. Smiles replaced tension. Meetings became spaces of collaboration, not control. The halls that once echoed with condescension now buzzed with creativity and purpose. Within months, Sterling signed 3 major contracts, including one with a leading telecommunications giant that had previously refused to work with us due to Daniel Pierce's reputation. Our stock soared 35% in the first quarter. Investors who once doubted the company now praised its rebirth under my leadership. Business Insider ran a headline calling me the woman who revived a tech empire. But what truly fulfilled me wasn't the profits or the press. It was walking past the employee break room one afternoon and seeing Lisa and her team laughing, sketching out new ideas on a whiteboard, free, respected, and inspired. That was the real victory. Meanwhile, Daniel Pierce and his former allies had faded into obscurity. One by one, their names disappeared from the industry. Some were banned from working in tech due to violations of their contracts. One even tried to sue Sterling but failed miserably. Every piece of evidence stood against them that Daniel Pierce's downfall became a story people whispered about. A warning to those who thought power made them invincible. I later heard he was living in a small Chicago apartment, working retail, his wife long gone. The man who once sneered at me now avoided his own reflection and me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt peaceful because my fight had never been about destroying him. It was about rebuilding something good. 6 months later, Sterling had transformed into everything I once dreamed it could be. From my office window, I looked down at the glowing tower, floors alive with energy, laughter echoing through the corridors. The company had healed, and so had daughter profits reach record highs. More importantly, our culture thrived. I launched a mentorship program for women in tech, a promise that no one else would have to face the silence and humiliation I once endured. Sterling was no longer just a corporation. It was a symbol of fairness and resilience. As I stepped out of my office one evening, I watched my employees chatting, smiling, and walking freely, unafraid. That was the moment I realized true revenge isn't about ruining others. It's about creating something better in their place. I entered the boardroom where my new executive team awaited, the air alive with excitement about our next expansion plan. As I took my seat at the head of the table, I wasn't the woman who once sat silently beside arrogant men. I was Amelia Grant, CEO of Sterling Corporation. And this was only the beginning. Evelyn's story isn't just one of revenge. It's a story of justice, perseverance, and leadership. It's proof that power doesn't belong to manipulators, but to those with integrity. Because in the end, the truth always surfaces and those who deserve it rise.